All right. So, for those of you that are not part of the class, welcome. This is one of our lectures in crisis leadership for the public health professional from the Arnold School of Public Health, University of South Carolina. Um, I think for everybody that's a normal student, we'll expect you to kind of engage as normal, but we'll have a couple bits in the discussion that'll be, or a couple bits in the lecture that'll be for discussion. I think if you're a normal student, just engage as you would normally. But for those that are observers, feel free to add your thoughts into the chat. We'd welcome that. We're going to be talking about mental health and well-being, and I want to start by kind of highlighting that I am not a mental health professional. And even though I ran these slides by some folks who are mental health professionals, a theme that of this discussion will be the role of the non-mental health professionals in crisis management, and how you don't necessarily need to be, a licensed therapist to be able to have some sort of positive impact. Um, but that said, if we're looking to get like really into the weeds about mental health pieces, certainly happy to take those questions and move them forward. But before we get into the weeds of it, we'll start with our current events. So, John Andrew, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad. Yeah, my name is John Andrew Redmond. I'm a graduate student at the University of South Carolina Arnold School of Public Health. I'm a first year master's student in environmental health science, and I'm presenting our current event for today on Hurricane Raphael. Next slide, please. Okay, so generally speaking, we're looking at the National Hurricane Center forecast that was provided at 10 a.m. this morning for Hurricane Raphael. And I believe I just checked, they're experiencing the landfall from the hurricane with 115 mile an hour sustained winds. So it's currently impacting right now and into tomorrow morning. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about a little bit more of the details. It originated as Tropical Depression 18, and then it intensified into Tropical Cyclone named Raphael over the Central Caribbean Sea on Sunday evening, so a couple days ago. And currently, it's a Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale. As of yesterday at 10 a.m., or excuse me, this morning at 10 a.m., it was located 130 miles south-southeast of Havana, Cuba, and the eye is going to make landfall in Cuba tomorrow morning at 3 a.m. But like I said, they're currently experiencing those impacts. Projected to be a near major hurricane intensity, and I believe it is now that it's intensified a little bit before impacting landfall in western Cuba. They're having hurricane force winds, life threatening storm surge, and destructive waves all across western Cuba on any of the coastal regions, as well as the lower and middle Keys and the northern Gulf Coast of the United States are expected to receive impacts over the next 2 days. Those are kind of the other two areas of land that's going to be impacted by it, besides Western Cuba, which is going to be getting the brunt of the impact. And in that region, they're going to have heavy rainfall and flash flooding, especially in the higher terrain regions of that country. Next slide, please. This is the tropical storm force wind speed probability, and it's for Wednesday to Monday. So we're seeing pretty much that side of Western Cuba entirely impacted by tropical storm force winds and a tiny bit of the Keys there in the north. Um, and the next slide, we're looking at the Pacific Disaster Center kind of event brief for the hurricane. The population exposed for this is about 1.63 million people, 16% children, 69% adults, and 16% elderly. There's about 100 hospitals exposed to this disaster and about 300 schools. With that is almost $23 billion worth of capital, so infrastructure, private homes, anything like that exposed to the disaster. And the likelihood of the impact, I would say this would be directly in Cuba, would be to their power and their infrastructure, with that being severe impacts, communication and transport severe as well. And for the needs that these people are going to be needing in the days following the disaster, about 1 billion calories per day, 2 million liters of water per day, 65,100-liter waste bins for debris, and then 2 million square meters of shelter for any displaced people. Next slide. And so looking at the current response for this, there's about 40,000 people in the Guantanamo province of Cuba that have been evacuated or under evacuation notice. The Cuban power grid, like I said, in severe impact, has already been compromised by Hurricane Oscar 2 weeks prior, and so faces further catastrophic disruption, excuse me. In the wake of that, they may have already began restoring power, but this is going to knock it out entirely once again. Looking at the Cayman Islands, we're seeing widespread power outages and infrastructure damage has been reported as they've already had some impacts there. And looking into the U.S., energy companies are evacuating non-essential personnel and the offshore oil platforms off the Gulf Coast. The next slide. Looking at the context of this hurricane and the 24 hurricane season in the Atlantic, Raphael is a 17th named storm, and it's been a notably active and unpredictable season. It's been erratic, with a notable lull in activity during August and September, which is typically the most active months. Even so, it was bookended by intense Category 5 hurricanes like Beryl in June and Helene in September, as well as Milton. And we've definitely experienced the impacts of that in the southeast US. I believe that may be the last slide. Yes. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, John Andrew. I was gonna say great, but not great. This is bad. But one of the benefits of having a course about crisis management in hurricane season that we have stuff to talk about. So on to our opening discussion. Again, for the folks who are just joining us as observers, feel free to toss your thoughts in the chat. But we hear about mental health a lot. We talk about it a lot. What is it? What's mental health? Open floor.
I don't have my hand thing, so I'm just gonna speak. But
Yeah.
basically like how we think and how we feel in simple terms.
Okay. Great. Anybody else?
Maybe the like overall wellness of like the mind and mental state of a person.
Sorry, you came in really soft. Can you
On my
repeat that?
headphones. Hold on. Um. Okay.
Tia is connecting to audio. While we're waiting on Tia, anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Maybe.
Tia, we got you. Oh,
I don't have the hand raise thing too, but I'm gonna just jump in. It's like involves the emotional and like social aspects of an individual.
great. Tia, last chance.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you hear me
Yeah, we
now?
got you. Yep.
Okay. I was saying the maybe the overall like wellness of the mind and like mental state of a person.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think all of those things are correct. And I think it's one of those things that the more time we spend on it, the more complex we realize that it is. So this is how the World Health Organization defines what mental health is. So mental health as the state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize abilities, learn and work well, contribute to their community. And I think the kind of the so what is that it's present in all aspects of health. It's present in all aspects of normal life. That mental health is fundamental to health more broadly. And then that second piece is what we pulled out of this World Mental Health Report, and that mental health is integral to all of the things that we do. Is the main takeaway from this. So, like mental health, a thing we hear about a lot is trauma. So, want to spend a second because a lot of what we're going to end up talking about in with respect to mental health and crises and disasters is going to be related to trauma. But the guy we're about to hear from is Bessel van der Kolk. He was one of the first folks to really pioneer PTSD. So, what PTSD research. So what is it? What is it not? And connecting trauma to long-term effects that occur after a crisis is kind of the bread and butter of this guy's research. So on to some thoughts about trauma.
The problem with trauma is that it starts off with something that happens to us, but that's not where it stops, because it changes your brain. Much of the imprint of trauma is in that very primitive survival part of your brain that I like to call the cockroach brain. There's a part of you that just picks up what's dangerous and what's safe. And when you're traumatized, that little part of your brain, which is usually very quiet, continues to just send messages. I'm in danger. I'm not safe. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to things as if you're in danger. We're talking about survival. We're talking about staying alive. And so some people go into fight flight, or on a more primitive level, people's brain shuts down and they collapse. You have these automatic responses that are not a product of your cognitive assessment, they're a product of your animal brain trying to stay alive in the face of something that that part of your brain interprets as a life threat. And the problem then becomes that you are not able to engage or to learn or to see other people's point of view or to coordinate your feelings with your thinking.
So in a lot of psychological trauma research that comes out, that it's that, you know, something has happened and after the event has occurred, that some sort of mental, emotional functions, some disruptions continue to be present. And want to be really clear that we're not talking about like blunt force trauma to the head, right? Like we're talking about trauma in the psychological sense. And after some sort of event, and when we say event, we're talking about emergencies, disasters, crises, that after the event has concluded, that people continue to feel like things are still occurring. And the piece that's underlined there is really the bit that we're going to focus on, in that after experiencing some sort of event that induces feelings of or induces symptoms of psychological trauma, that it inhibits normal functions. So the way that people go about their lives on a daily basis, that some aspect of that is not behaving normally. So knowing that emergencies, disasters, crises, that these are things that can elicit some of these longer term psychological impacts. Why does mental health support matter? Why is this our problem? Open floor.
It matters because if we want to assist in post-disaster relief, we need to know how to deal with the different types of reactions that might occur. And every person responds or reacts differently when they experience trauma.
Totally. Yeah, John Andrew.
This kind of reminds me of the question you would ask our guest speakers when we would have the guest speakers. How does it feel to be connected to like a disaster, an event that's like heavily publicized? Like we had the Coast Guard response. One of the people that responded to the Coast Guard or the event, the Baltimore Bridge collapse, and she spoke to how she felt about it being so highly publicized. And I think that the mental health support is so important as compared to it's just as important as other things, you know, like administrative stuff. And if somebody doesn't have that support, they're going to fail in other aspects of their job.
Totally. Anybody else before we move on? All right. Couple good ones in the chat. So we're going to spend the next bit of time talking about psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is a tool in the toolbox that helps us deal with some of these things. Psychological first aid is from a variety of different folks who weigh in on the matter, viewed as low risk, practical, pragmatic support that can help address immediate needs and concerns on a psychological front. All of the things that we're about to talk about are not just reserved for psychosocial support, for therapists, for professionals in the mental health space, but also that we're not giving you the steps to talk about what therapy is. It's not a debriefing, it's not a diffusing, it's not critical incident stress management. And then we're going to talk a lot about engaging with folks who have gone through a crisis, and a lot of this we're going to speak a bit about how to listen, but that psychological first aid is not about pressuring people to share things that they're not comfortable with. Psychological first aid, along with other types of psychological interventions, so things that happen in a post-disaster, post-crisis environment. The goal is to avoid the long-lasting negative psychological impacts. So when we talk about trauma manifesting as people still feel like they're in danger after the event has concluded, this is about trying to stave that off. This is a mitigation measure. Also, psychological first aid, it's not the thing that's going to solve all of the problem. It's called first aid because that's like a good analogy for what we're talking about. It's not long-term therapy. This is the stuff that everybody should be able to be armed with if they come across a situation where they think that some support might be needed. And that, the bit about this is the kind of the bare minimum of what is safe and pragmatic until some sort of higher level of care becomes available. And that's how regular first aid works, right? Like no one's expecting someone who's providing first aid to solve like some crazy kind of problem that you need an operating room for. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. So the methodology for psychological first aid, and again, we're gonna hit kind of the big points, the wave tops, the so what of each of these, and we'll share some resources at the end. But the methodology, the acronym is RAPID. So we'll talk about reflective listening and why that matters. Assessment, what it is, what it isn't. We've talked about assessments in this class before. Prioritization and how that can mean different things. Intervention, which is actually doing the piece that all this is aimed at. And disposition is how do we wrap it up. But before we get into it, how do you know someone's listening to you? So like just no wrong answers. We all communicate all the time. How do you know that someone's listening to you?
If it's in person, eye contact.
Yeah, totally. Saleh?
Sometime by following up with my conversation, like asking or note or feedback about my subject. So if and you feel it when someone disrupted or something, so you can stop the conversation or to restore his attention or her attention, you can ask back about something. So to make sure that the conversation is in one page.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? In just like normal life, how do you know that someone's listening to you? Take one more though.
Definitely like, sorry.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Definitely through like active engagement, like asking questions or just showing that you're interested.
Yeah. Tia, what'd you have?
I was just also say like body language sometimes is also very telling, like being shifty kind of to me sometimes seems like not being as engaged in other things. So like that.
Yeah, all those are great. So part of this process starts with understanding listening. So across a handful of different studies about listening and listening methods, a bunch of different techniques were tried. And reflective listening was found to be the most effective and the most quick. And we'll talk about what that means. But other techniques being like parroting, where somebody says something to you and you parrot it back to them like exactly. Like you mimic exactly what they're going to say. There's another technique that was tried, which is like, I'm just going to be silent and I'm going to like awkwardly stare and, at whoever is talking to me. That I'm not going to say anything and create the space for them to fill was another method. But when we talk about reflective listening at being the most effective, the most quickly, effective means at how quickly can we get to a point where whoever's speaking feels like they're being listened to, and not just feel like they're being listened to, but they feel like they're being understood. And so across a litany of different listening methods, different listening techniques, reflective listening was what was determined to be, what got us to that point the most quickly. And then this is a line from a training that in the crisis management context, that sometimes we must acknowledge that someone has had a hard time before they're ready to receive assistance. And so with reflective listening and psychological first aid, we're trying to establish some empathy. We're trying to let people know that we are listening to them. We're trying to get there as quickly as possible to get them assistance as quickly as possible. And that's that, if we understand what they're saying, that's a bridge that gets to trust, and trust is what gets to compliance, which is what we need to be able to give them an effective intervention. So reflective listening is somebody's going to tell me something. And then I'm going to paraphrase it back to them. I'm going to put what they said into my own words. I'm not just going to parrot it back to them exactly. I'm going to put it back into my own words and make sure that I capture what I think is the main point of the message. So I think, an example of like, hey, it sounds like the hardest thing for you was leaving your home. Or it seems like trying to remain calm around your kids was really difficult. Like it's you take what you think you're hearing and give it back to them. And that's reflective listening. The next piece is assessment. So as folks go through a crisis, people come out of disaster environments, we can generally put those people into three groups. I'm going to start with the first group in kind of the school of thought that gave us psychological first aid. We call them the Eustace group. And these are people who are like doing okay. They've had a hard time. Things are not going well for them, but like they're not inhibited in their ability to like carry on, to go about their business. It's not necessarily acknowledging that they're like happy with the things that are happening around them, but like they are able to proceed, in their life without any problems. We're going to skip the second group and go to the third group, which are the people who are like obviously in need of higher care. These are people who who need like medical attention. They are not able to navigate themselves through their life through the psychological impact of whatever it is that they've experienced. So that second group is in the middle. So there are people who are fine. There are people who are obviously not fine. And then there's the group of people who, may or may not be fine, may or may not be struggling with some aspect of exposure to trauma or have some symptoms. And we call that the distress group. And that's really who we're focusing on. Because as we come across people in that first group, like, okay, hey, acknowledge you're having a hard time, but like, you're going to be all right. The third group needs, proper, significant, higher level of medical attention. That second group is we're trying to figure out what's what. And drawing the line between groups 2 and 3 is important to be able to know how to do. And so in the table, we've got, things on the left are indicative of distress, whereas things on the right are indicative of dysfunction. As we notice things that are on that right side, we're recognizing that, hey, this is outside the scope of what I'm ready to deal with as someone who's, trying to apply first aid. Whereas things that are on the left are varying degrees of common present in different disaster scenarios. But as we see things that pop on the right side of the table, those are our signals that it's beyond the scope of first aid. And as we start to see some of these symptoms, we have to prioritize needs in a situation where either there are multiple people that we are trying to prioritize and trying to get a sense of, who do we get to first? We're just one person, or if it's a sense of if there's a single person that has multiple needs, how do you figure out what to attack first? Two schools of thought for going about the process of triage, which is, how do we sort whose needs are most important? So evidence-based triage is, if we go back one slide, evidence-based triage is how many of these things do I see? How many of these things do I observe in the people that I'm talking to, in whoever I think I'm dealing with? And that's as I see more signs that are evident of psychological distress or dysfunction, that's, whoever has the most worst stuff is of the highest need. Risk-based triage is a different approach that is less about, what are you currently displaying, and it's more about what have you been exposed to. There are people who, if you're exposed to a whole bunch of negative aspects of emergencies, disasters, crises, people don't manifest signs of disruption and dysfunction in any kind of universal manner. So there is a way of you triage needs based on who's been exposed to the most worst stuff, even if they're not presenting presently the signs of any sort of distress or dysfunction. So after we've so reflective listening is a tool. Assessment is a thing that kind of lets us know what we're dealing with. Prioritization is who we're going to talk to and in what order. The intervention is what we're actually doing. So the goal of an intervention in psychological first aid is compassionate supportive presence. Getting back to the thought that psychological first aid is meant to be pragmatic, low risk. It's the bit about it's first aid. It's not open heart surgery. We're not committing somebody to a long-term therapy regime. That we're going to try to meet their needs. We're going to try to help them figure some things out. And that if we need to be a bridge to resources, we will be that. And that every time it's been studied that I'm aware of, the most predictive factor of disaster resilience from a psychological standpoint is social support. So people who feel like they have social support, and whether that's through folks, networks and family members and friends that they were connected to pre-disaster, or if it's through somebody like somebody sitting in a disaster recovery center who's offering this kind of support. Access to social support is the biggest piece of folks who experience disasters and feel like they have positive outcomes. And how they feel about those outcomes matters. So this is what the intervention looks like. And psychological first aid, so all of the other pieces of that RAPID acronym, all the pieces of that methodology are in support of this. This is what it actually looks like. This is what doing the thing looks like. So we're going to ask what happened and we're going to let them go. We'll paraphrase those key points. That's reflective listening, to let them know that we're listening and that we're understanding. Once we have an understanding of what's happened to them, we will ask how it mattered to them. How is this impacting them? Ask about their well-being and know that it's, maybe not going to be great. As people say things that are ambiguous, we ask them to clarify. And part of that methodology is that in the process of asking people to clarify what something means to them, we are prompting them to make sense of their experience. In the bit about stable, unstable, and that's really a statement of their emotional state. that if they are, if we think that they are, you know, just outwardly very emotional, we can, you know, we can encourage them to focus on specific things, different tasks. I think the bit about allow catharsis is in direct response to the things that they bring up. So I think the example of the like, hey, it sounds like you know, trying to remain calm around your kids is really hard. I think this is the time where you ask, you know, what did you want to say, but you felt like you couldn't say it because your kids were around. Let people have that moment. Um, and then I think it's more nuanced than saying you're letting them get it out of their system, but there is a bit of that we're supporting here. And then you know, connect folks to resources. That's the biggest piece here, and that's once you've kind of let them feel heard and feel supported, it's a matter of what do you need and how can we get it to you. And it's a not different process for people who do present as being, you know, emotionally stable, that they're having a hard time but they want to get some stuff off their chest. You know, you want to let them know things that are happening. Hey, the way that you're feeling, yeah, there's a bunch of people who are feeling that way. That's not to minimize it. That's just what, you know, what you're going through may feel normal. That's okay. If people have things that are just, you know, wrong. So if we think back to, you know, Hurricane Helene, as folks come to the table ready to talk about how, you know, FEMA is denying aid because of some political agenda. You know, there is a time in this process to say, well, you know, that's not what's happening. Followed up immediately by your needs are, you know, it sounds like your needs are this. Here are the resources that I think you might benefit from. That's how you proceed through this. After you come to kind of the conclusion, we've listened to people, we've let them say what they want to say. We've provided them some support. We've connected them with some resources. The conversation has to end. And I think two pieces. There's the question of where do we go from here? That's their question to answer. That's their question to answer. And it's also really important to acknowledge that I don't know is a totally acceptable answer. Similarly, there is a question around, you know, is there anything else you think I need to know? There's a ton of power in that question. And that folks who, if through the rest of the conversation, felt like they haven't had an opportunity to get something out that matters to them, that's the kind of question before you kind of shut the door on the interaction that lets people, you know, offload any last steam or bring to light anything that really matters to them. So the two kind of closer questions: where do we go from here, and is there anything else you think I need to know? And then you have not an obligation in the sense that you're required to do it, but just in the way to close this responsibly is you voice what you think you've seen. That if people are able to function, you can say, hey, I think you know, I recognize you've had a hard time, but I think you'll be okay. Or hey, I'm observing that you're really struggling, and here's what I think you know, we might be able to connect by way of higher care, more resources. I think it is okay to acknowledge in closing the conversation that, like, hey, I'm not a therapist, but I think what I'm seeing is indicative of a need, you know, for X, Y, and Z. I think when we'll talk about this in a second, but if it's somebody you know, if it's somebody you work with, if you're, you know, I think the situations where this is a tool where you're just like sitting and waiting for disaster victims to come to you, that's not really the scenarios where this kind of process is being used. I think this is a really strong peer support tool. So if it's somebody you know and somebody you work with, ask to follow up. Like, hey, can I come check on you in some period of time? And I think that's super important. That it's not just, you know, a good piece of the methodology. It's just a good part of being a responsible kind of, you know, person in the crisis management space. So related to the subject of peer support, and as we kind of shift the focus from, you know, just broadly people who have a hard time to people who work in this space. Why might people who work in the space, so emergency managers, disaster responders, why might they be hesitant to seek assistance of this nature? Yeah, John Adrian.
I feel like it could easily be emergency manager getting ingrained in their work and so focused on it that they're not taking time to think about themselves or their own mental health. They're focused on getting to an end goal or to serving some population, but don't step back for a minute and think about what they need as themselves.
Yeah, totally. Anybody else?
I think, oh, sorry, let me let.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Basically, I think with crisis management professionals, they work with a lot of people who've gone through like severe traumatic experiences, have lost everything, and are just dealing with a lot. And I feel like for some of them, they might think, I don't have it as bad, I'm not suffering as much. And so then they may think that their problems aren't as important as other people's.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also sometimes it can be a bit of ego into it where you're in the position that you're the one expected to help. So how can you be asking for help? Although that's not how we should be thinking.
Yeah, I think all of those points are super, super valid. I think every time it's been studied. Sorry, Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a perspective from someone who's further along in a career. I will tell you that a lot of first responders from police, it could be Coast Guard, it could be fire, EMS, any of the first responder organizations, they're resistant to self-referring for a mental health treatment or intervention because it may affect their careers. They could lose security clearance, they could lose their badge, lose their gun, lose their operational status, get reassigned to a position. That it would be looked at as possibly a shameful move from their peers, and also they could fear termination for not being able to deliver. So those are considerations from the perspective of first responders. Over.
Yeah, yeah, all great points. I think every time it's been studied, and I think across communities, I think there's kind of the folks we think of by way of traditional first responders, but also like I think nurses is a group that a lot of this applies to, but people who help other people for a profession, people who help others for a living are notoriously bad and measurably, quantifiably bad at asking for help themselves. And there's a bunch of different reasons that have come out in a bunch of different studies. And there are stigmas around it. And that if I ask for help, I'm gonna, for things that have been said, I'm not gonna be able to help other people. And that me being someone who helps others is so central to my identity that I don't want to give that up by asking for help and risking, not being able to do this thing that I want to do. I think there are some pieces of it that in firefighters, wildland firefighters, that, hey, I'm raking in overtime right now, and there is a financial hit to me if I, pull myself off the line. And that, or what are all of my peers going to say if I'm the only one that puts my hand up and says that I need some time. There are a whole bunch of different reasons that are real, they're present, and it keeps people from asking for help. And I think as we kind of get into what that means, what do we do about it? A couple things. So that bit about self-care is that you cannot become a victim to the process of helping. That If you jeopardize your ability to help others, you're not, by not helping yourself, you're limiting your ability to help others. And that the way that you can help the most people in the long term is to be around, and being around requires you to take care of yourself. I think a note from me is just the compassion fatigue is real. Downward spiraling is a thing. I think we all kind of know what that looks like. And then in some of those studies where people talk about people who help others professionally being resistant to self-flag as needing help, a good practice that has come out is have somebody that is uninvolved in the field check on you. That's a number of different times that's been studied. That's been highlighted as a good practice solution. So in this class, we've talked about this phrase in a bunch of different contexts, that do no harm, but do no harm. If we don't want to do harm, we have to know what it looks like. We got to know what it feels like. So for responders, but also just people who are around emergencies, disasters, crises, in the post-crisis piece, there are risk factors, and these are things that peak among crisis management professionals in sort of the post-disaster environment. I think the recklessness, the impulsiveness, reclusiveness, anyone who has spent much time in the field can probably point to either firsthand examples or secondhand examples of where exiting some sort of crisis environment led to some of this. The rumination bit is playing things back and forth, playing decisions back and forth. And I think a piece that anecdotally I've seen folks struggle to acknowledge is we make the best decisions we can with the information that was available to us when it was time to make a decision. So if we could go back with all the information we have post-disaster and do things differently, would we have liked to do over? Absolutely. But that's not how it works. So we have to sit with being okay with, we made the best decisions we could when it was time to make the decisions with the information that we had. So the CDC has some good guidance for folks who work in the crisis space. Won't read it all to you, but that bit in bold I think is really important. That particular, I think, disaster response specifically. I think a bunch of people get into the crisis management, emergency management, disaster response fields because they want to respond to things. That's kind of the exciting part of the work. But just because something is exciting, just because something is happening in a response sense, pulling 120-hour weeks is not synonymous with bringing your best to the fight for the duration of a response. So being able to take that time during a response, that I think it's really funny when I see things that when you're in the middle of a response, like maintain a healthy diet, try to get enough sleep. Like, oh, you mean being healthy is healthy even during a disaster response? Like, what a thought. But it's true. And I think too, from a peer support side, like being able to hold others accountable. I think that best practice of like having someone else be someone that checks on you. It's also the same of like telling someone who is kind of in the trenches with you of like, hey, make sure I don't eat like shit today. That is a thing that matters. And then after the response, there is a bit, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but catch up on things, reflect on what it meant to you as a person, as a professional. It is okay. We talked about those, or we showed those risk factors as they present. It's okay. Acknowledge them as they come through. Do no harm, but do no harm. So outside of the CDC guidance, if we think about stress as pressure, like physical pressure, so I think we spend a lot of time in my job talking about diving, and we talk about what that means. So physical pressure, prolonged periods can elicit a physiological, so a physical, but also a psychological response when you're exposed to immense amount of pressures for a long period of time. If you don't respect the time that it takes to decompress, there are negative consequences. And the stress that goes along with the psychological piece of working in this space is really no different. That as we exit high pressure environments, we have to take the time to decompress. And as we notice things that are happening, as we see some of those risk factors, we acknowledge them. That just because I notice that I'm being really reclusive after a disaster, it doesn't mean that like I'm going to be prone to trauma for the rest of my life. It is better to call those things out when we see them. And I think kind of the personal example is after Hurricane Harvey, I have like a really, really distinct memory of sitting at my desk and looking at a bunch of reports that I needed to catch up on and feeling like, man, I don't give a shit about any of this. But it was being able to acknowledge that feeling that like, this is work that I need to get done. This stuff is important, but I'm feeling like I'm pulling away from it. That the awareness of that feeling is what helped us get through it. So the presence of risk factors is not a death sentence. And then engage in peer support. If you're somebody that would offer peer support, you should also be somebody that would be willing to receive peer support. Look after your people. And I've got a few folks on the call from my current organization who will know exactly who this second piece is coming from. But engaging in peer support is if somebody comes to you with something, I think a really good way of going about that moment is, hey, what do you want from me? Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to give you advice? Or do you want me to do something? And it's the same when you're the one that goes to someone else. Hey, I just want you to listen. I'm going to vent and I want you to listen to me. Or like, hey, I'd like your advice on something. Or I want you to take some kind of action because I need blah, 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 blah. I think it's if you know that you're going into that conversation wanting one of those things, it just helps you navigate it. And then lastly, a lot of what we pulled for this lecture in the psychological first aid piece comes straight from the methodology of this guy, George Everly, who's kind of the pioneer of psychological first aid. Through Johns Hopkins University, they have a free course on it on Coursera. If you're interested in taking a much deeper dive in psychological first aid, the foundation psychologically that it's built on, and then not tricks, but tips for applying some of this. It's a free course. Would recommend you look into it. And then that closes us out. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll hang out for a little bit if there's anybody who wants to talk about anything. Otherwise, see everybody next time.